Well, now our story moves beyond Florence, but the man whose name became synonymous with the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, was actually nurtured initially in the Florence of the Medici. He was born in Vinci, and Da Vinci means from Vinci. It is not his last name. So in this case, it's actually appropriate to refer to this artist as Leonardo, not as Da Vinci. Before I continue with the career of Leonardo da Vinci, though, let me give just a really brief introduction to the 16th century High Italian Renaissance. Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, was a relentless enemy of Italy's republics and not especially generous to his own people either. But he did have the good taste to hire Leonardo da Vinci, which gave him a more prominent and frankly a more approving place in history books than he would otherwise have earned. But if Cosimo de' Medici, Federico da Montefeltro, and then Ludovico Sforza dominated art patronage in the 15th and early 16th century, it would be popes, and especially the warrior and patron Pope Julius II, who would dominate the later part of the 15th century. The Pope's ambition was to rebuild Rome to rival the great days of the Roman Empire. He set out to complete the decoration of the Sistine Chapel and, far more ambitiously, to build on the site of Old St. Peter's the most spectacular church in Christendom. Now, the early Renaissance produced superb artists. You saw a lot of them. The High Renaissance produced superstars. The good news is you won't have as many names to keep straight in the next few lectures, but you must know these heavy hitters. In Venice, and we'll hit this in the last lecture of this unit, the High Renaissance took a slightly different course, less intellectual, more colorful, more filled with light, frankly more sensual. And then finally, overshadowing the second half of the 16th century was the challenge posed by Martin Luther and his followers. We're going to address the art of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in the next two units, but we will see the shadow cast by the church schism, particularly in the later works by Michelangelo, which will be the next lecture. So let's turn to our first superstar. Now, relatively few works by Leonardo da Vinci survive, and one of the greatest, The Last Supper, began to disintegrate almost as soon as it was painted. But even in his lifetime, his contemporaries realized that Leonardo da Vinci had raised the bar for painters, really forever. Many people think he's the greatest painter that ever lived. So after his apprenticeship with Verrocchio, Leonardo moved to Milan, where for the next 20 years he was court painter to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, a fearsome military leader and determined patron of the arts. You may recall from your textbook that Leonardo sold himself to the Duke primarily as a military engineer, and just mentioned in passing that he painted better than anyone else. Modest fellow, but deserved. His range of interests and discoveries may yet be unmatched in human history. So let's allow ourselves just a brief glimpse from the same video you just watched, and note especially his careful study of the eye and optics. One of the characteristic features of Leonardo was that his scientific studies of anatomy informed his art. So this is going to be an oversimplification. But when we look at the paintings of the early Italian Renaissance, that is the 1400s or the 15th century, we see two somewhat separate strands, although they're sometimes combined. So there's what you might call the mathematical strand, artists applying rules of perspective to create optically accurate depictions of three-dimensional space. Think of Brunelleschi, Masaccio, Mantegna. And then there were the more poetical, even sentimental painters, Botticelli, Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi. But in Leonardo, the mathematical and the poetic merge. And this painting offers an excellent illustration of this new synthesis. Now, there are actually two versions of this painting. The one you see here is the earlier version, which now hangs in the Louvre. The later version is in the National Gallery of London. Note that the sweetly beautiful figures, I think, evoke Botticelli's goddesses and Madonnas, but the complex, precise composition echoes the mathematical brilliance of Masaccio or Mantegna. Again, Leonardo is very much a force of synthesis. So these diagrams, let me try to get them built without having them disappear. Okay, I think that's right. So these diagrams help us see how multiple isosceles triangles draw our eyes dynamically to the figure. And this kind of triangular composition is going to become more and more typical of painting. And again, Leonardo was not the only person who did this, but was the most significant person to introduce this particular style of composition. He also, in this painting, takes chiaroscuro, remember that's the contrast between light and dark, to new heights. And that's partly because he is a master of this new medium of oil paint, or at least new to Italy. As you saw in the earlier video, tempera dried quickly. It had less subtle colors. You have those brilliant, wonderfully brilliant colors of tempera, but it's harder to have subtle shading. And that's the great strength of oil, the gradations of color and shadow. Sfumato is a term that's really applied more to the works of Leonardo da Vinci than any other artist, although you may see it again. And it basically means smoky in Italian, or hazy or misty. It's a characteristic of Leonardo's paintings. Even though he had a masterful command of line, and you see his drawings, and there are thousands of pages of his drawings. We have many more Leonardo drawings than we do paintings. But in his paintings and some of his drawings, he deliberately blurs the boundaries of his figures. And again, this is partly trying to capture how our eye perceives reality, particularly from some distance. We see Leonardo's optical insight also in his use of atmospheric perspective, imitating the way the eye sees more distant features as less distinct, as paler and bluer than the objects in the foreground. And finally, this is still another way that Leonardo combines, if you will, poetry with precision. The painting makes the figures an integral part of their landscape. They're not just plopped in front of it. And the landscape isn't just used to show perspective, the way some of the architectural landscapes of the 1400s kind of seem to be. Also, the figures are very much tied to one another with gestures. The pyramidal composition, the way the figures point at each other, all ties them together, and it gives the painting a rare sense of unity and coherence. Oh, one more triangle. So this slide illustrates atmospheric perspective. And note that the image on the right hand is actually a photograph. I think it's probably the clearest illustration of atmospheric perspective. So again, you see that Leonardo da Vinci is trying to capture the optical perspective, what our eye sees. There's something else that's kind of intriguing about this composition. This is not an original contribution from me. It's not really in your textbook either. But I picked it up from one of the art history lectures I listened to preparing to podcast this one. So which figure draws our attention and seems to be kind of the focal point of the painting? Actually, I think there are different answers you could give because the painting is so unified. All of the different figures are tied together. But one of the art historians that I consulted makes the argument that the painting really focuses on the young John the Baptist, which was quite original of Leonardo. But note that it's John that Mary seems to be gazing at. It's John whose gesture of prayer toward Jesus draws our eye. And it's, Jesus is pointing, himself is pointing at John. So what about that angel? What is she looking at, or who is she looking at? Well, like many Leonardo da Vinci women, her expression is hard to read. It's enigmatic. It's a puzzle. But it seems to me that she's really looking at us, although kind of sideways, kind of a sneaky glance. And in that way, she draws us again as viewers into the scene, just as the triangle pulls us, just as the composition and that background landscape draws us in. Okay, cartoons aren't just Roadrunner. A cartoon is a sketch, a rough draft for a painting. Although this doesn't seem like a very rough draft, but it really captures Leonardo's superb command of both line and of shading. Often you'll see an artist who seems to be really a specialist in one or the other. Leonardo seems to be here, I think, the master of both line and shading. And he manages to give his figures realistic, substantial modeling while still infusing his faces with personality and mystery. Note that sometimes Leonardo employs sfumato, blurring the boundary between his figures and the background. And sometimes, look for example at Mary's shoulders. He draws sharp and distinct lines. Okay, this is a painting of Ludovico Sforza's 15-year-old mistress, Cecilia. It's not in your textbook. It may be my favorite Leonardo da Vinci painting, so you get stuck seeing it. I actually find her expression even more intriguing than the Mona Lisa's. And I thought you all might be interested because obviously she's a great deal closer to your age. So what do you think? What is she looking at? Is she resigned? Is she content? Is she happy? Is that the beginning of a smile? Or is that a sad face? I think it's very hard to read. There was a major exhibit of Leonardo da Vinci's Milan works in London a few years ago, and in an article about the exhibition, this analysis of my favorite painting appeared. I realize it's a very busy slide, hard to read. You'll have a somewhat easier to read printout, but it really bears looking at, if only to give you a sense of all the different things that can be found in a painting that we could find really in all the paintings we're looking at if we only had more time. Let me just share a few tidbits. You'll, I hope, read this on your own. So she's wearing a black necklace that's made out of jet, and that may be a reference to Ludovico Sforza's nickname, the Moor, because he had quite a dark complexion. Ermine, the animal she's holding, its fur was very expensive and only worn by the wealthy, but it was also a symbol for pregnancy. This young woman did bear a child to Ludovico Sforza, and it's possible she was pregnant at the time that this was painted. We don't have exact dates. Note that Leonardo added brilliance to her eyes with what are called catchlights, tiny dots of white paint. They're added to the irises to capture the effect of light reflecting off the eye. You know, if you look at your friends when you're standing in the sunlight, you see these catchlights. Anyway, there's a lot of fun information here, and it gives you an idea, again, of how much more we could probably see in all of the paintings that we study. Well, I'm not going to linger here. We are so familiar with this painting that I actually think it's hard to see it with new eyes. But you should at this point be able to recognize Leonardo's masterful use of chiaroscuro, that contrast between light and dark, the sfumato, or smoky sort of blurring of the boundaries, the atmospheric perspective, you know, as you move into the background. It's also interesting, this portrait, which was probably, we're fairly certain, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant, Mona Lisa is just a nickname for it, is also significant for its three-quarter view. That was very rare up until this was painted and was much more common afterwards. By the way, in Italy, this is known as La Gioconda, after the woman whose portrait it almost certainly is. Okay, you've seen a video describing Leonardo's complex use of perspective in this painting. So I'm going to focus instead on the compositional challenge that all paintings of the Last Supper pose, and how Leonardo met this challenge and really, you know, changed the way this kind of composition would be done in the future. So this is a Last Supper painted by Ghirlandaio, who was a famous Renaissance painter, and you saw him in the last chapter. It was painted just 15 years before Leonardo's masterwork. So what differences do you notice? Well, I'm not going to throw in my 2 cents here because I have 2 video clips that I think do a much better job than I could. The first one looks at, again, the compositional challenge that faced all Last Supper painters. And the second video clip shows Leonardo's solution and also talks about the innovative and ultimately not successful paint techniques that he used. Well, we don't have time for much more of this, excellent video. As always, I recommend you take a look at it if you can. It goes on to tell how the painting began almost immediately to deteriorate. The kitchen was right behind the refectory wall, so heat from the kitchen damaged the painting, combining with Milan's humid air, which didn't do it any good. If it had been painted, you know, buon fresco, that is on wet fresco, which would have required Leonardo to work a great deal faster than he wanted to, it would have breathed. But Leonardo's innovative technique basically trapped moisture behind the painting, and it began to bubble and peel almost immediately. Leonardo himself repeatedly tried to repair it. And then in the late 19th century, Napoleon soldiers invaded Milan. They occupied the refectory as a barracks and basically took pot shots at the painting, gouged out portions of it. In fact, Napoleon was so shocked to hear this that he had the painted boarded up, which probably saved it until the 19th century restorers got their hands on it. I thought one of the most interesting things about the restoration in the Victorian era, as you saw from the video, and I think is one of the most intriguing, if you will, theological statements by this painting, is that Judas is portrayed as one of the disciples, sitting among them, and more bewildered than absolutely wicked. And in that sense, he represents all sinners, all people needing salvation. But in the 19th century, the restorers also took liberties with Judas, essentially to make him look more like a villain. They made his nose more hooked and his chin stick out more and his face more evil, which undid a lot of the point that Leonardo was trying to make. And then finally, the refectory took a direct hit from Allied bombers during World War II and actually spent 3 years with no roof, with the Last Supper protected again by boards. In the second half, before that, you'll enjoy this. And then there were the assaults from modern culture, advertising culture. The Last Supper has been used for any number of advertising campaigns. Here you see it selling high fashion. You can find more of these on the internet. Andy Warhol took several cuts at the Last Supper. This is just one of many of his pop art renditions of the Last Supper, his trademark fun and games. And then in the later part of the 20th century, there was a restoration effort that took 21 years, so a great deal longer than it took Leonardo to took him 5 years to paint the Last Supper. It was finished in 1999, and it's proved very controversial with art historians. Restoration is always controversial because basically to restore a painting is almost always to paint. I mean, sometimes you can sort of melt and help the paint that way. But usually restoration means some painting over. And even when restorers attempt to replicate the colors, the paints, etc., they're still covering a Leonardo with the art of the restorer. At any rate, we now are going to move on to our next superstar, Michelangelo, another extraordinarily versatile talent who also got bossed around by his patron, this time Pope Julius II.